Hello, everybody. Matt Radulac, Senior Director, Incident Response and Cloud Operations at Varonis and host of State of Cybercrime. I'm joined today by my co-host, David. You want to say hello?
Say hello. How are you, everybody?
It's such a pleasure to have you here today to connect with you on relevant topics in the cybercrime world. And so with that, let's crack right into it. We're going to go through our usual segments today. We'll start with, is there any good news? Make sure to mention some of the positive happenings in cybersecurity. We'll hear about different threat actors, exploits, and some of those different attacker techniques and attacker groups in the danger zone. We'll hear about a few vulnerabilities that you should be concerned about. We'll give you some tips in our segment, It's a Humble Ask. And then, of course, make sure to stick around to the end as we're going to give away a gift in our Viewer Appreciation Awards. So, let's start with, is there any good news? For those of you tuning in for the first time, oftentimes in cybersecurity, it's easy to think that only bad things are happening. Organizations are getting attacked. There's due 0 days and exploits that everyone should be concerned about. But fairly often, there is actually some good happenings in the cyberspace, and we like to cover those in this segment. First, for anyone who's recently visited Hawaii, planning on visiting Hawaii, or maybe even lives there and working remotely, fantastic idea, if you ask me. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security was able to thwart an attack on the undersea cables providing phone and internet service to Oahu, thus preserving the resilience of that infrastructure. Now, again, for a lot of people in any island nation, all the cables that traverse the internet and phone or other types of telecommunication do often travel on the seabed floor.
I have this image of the police apprehending the attackers as they're grinding a network tap into the cable on the ocean floor. Is that how it happened, Matt?
Well, you see, cyber attackers, they're a bit like Navy SEALs now. You know, they can carry out their cyber attacks over sea, air, or land. And so these are all things to be considered about. The kinetic part of cybersecurity is still a very real thing.
It's getting pretty sophisticated.
More interesting, though, is the proposal from the SEC on new cybersecurity disclosure rules. This is something that everyone should be talking about, especially if you're at a publicly traded company. One of the things that the SEC is proposing is around disclosing a cyber incident that your company experiences via an 8K filing with the SEC within 4 days of it being deemed material. Another thing that comes about in this proposal is really making cybersecurity a board level problem, requiring the board of directors to have cybersecurity expertise and have procedures and plans in place for managing cybersecurity risk, as well as providing oversight into the cybersecurity program at a particular company. This is really huge from both a standpoint of providing transparency to the world about cyber attacks that impact a particularly publicly traded company, and thus its investors would benefit from that information, but also really ensures accountability and knowledge of cybersecurity at that board level.
We had a great question about, well, what makes an incident material? The SEC actually defines this as an unauthorized occurrence on or conducted through a registrant's information systems that jeopardizes the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a registrant's information systems or any information residing therein. So, Matt, have you heard about this confidentiality, integrity, and availability thing before?
I think we call that the CIA triad, and broadly interpreted, this would mean that a lot of incidents that do in some way jeopardize the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that particular company's information would classify as being material. Though I'm sure this is going to be heavily debated over by general counsels and outside counsels from the moment that it's being proposed now to when it becomes full-blown rules and regulations.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty broad bucket. Anything that jeopardizes the security of information systems or the information inside them.
And I just want to echo one of our audience members' comments that one of the material differences here between a lot of what we would consider to be breach disclosure rules and regulations is that this goes beyond notifying of a breach and actually requires some sort of proactive measures, some assessment and management of cybersecurity risk, which does have a lot more to it than the typical, if an incident happens, you need to let us know, which we often talk about as breach disclosure and notification requirements. In our next segment, the danger zone, we'll talk about threat actors, attacks, exploits, and other groups that you should be concerned about. David, I'll take Unix commands for 200, please.
All right, yeah, so our first IT Jeopardy. So chat in your answers in the form of a question. So our first is this Unix command was created to archive files and directories to tape.
I'll take what is del star, David? Am I getting close?
I think I see some people coming in, but I'm sorry, your answers are not in the form of a question. Oh, there you go. What is DD? I was thinking of what is tar. So yep, that is and the reason I put that in there is because of something that's involved with Spring4Shell. Which is in the danger zone this week. Sorry.
Yeah, and tar files and Spring4Shell. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's not because it's April. Spring4Shell is named this way because there's vulnerability in 2 products made by Spring, which make actually, according to them, the world's most popular Java framework. It also, I think they named it because it sounds like Log4Shell, and looks like this is not as severe potentially as Log4Shell, and that's really because this is an old vulnerability that's kind of resurfaced, and that's not what makes it not as dangerous, but it's because the requirements seem like they're a little bit obscure. I'm sure there are a lot of servers running this way, but the app has to be deployed as a WAR file, which is a web archive, which is why we asked about the tar files. And it has to be running over Apache Tomcat, which is a Java-based web server. I used to deploy security tools that were written in Tomcat in like 1999. So I was kind of surprised to see that it's still out there. I think I still have some apps that are loading on a Solaris 8 box somewhere, but I'm waiting for them. So anyway, so far the app is deployed. If your application is deployed in the default way as a jar, the exploit doesn't work. So that's kind of why it may not be as overblown, but obviously patch looks like there's a variant of Mirai out there, the botnet that's reported to be looking for this vulnerability.
And I think
that's why it's called Spring4Shell.
Yeah, maybe they're just trying to live off of the name of Log4Shell and Log4j, though it doesn't appear to have quite the same impact.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now, for those of you that haven't been following, OAuth tokens, were retrieved from Heroku and Travis, which gave access to private GitHub repositories. Now, why does this matter? I think a lot of times when we think about the security of your SaaS applications, you don't often think about the interconnectivity between one particular application and another. So an attacker being able to gain access to a third-party application like Heroku or Travis, being able to find a token that gives access to an otherwise private GitHub repository might not be an attack vector that you've thought about before. And so one of the things that we encourage everyone to do is think about the interconnectivity risk that exists inside of code repositories, things like GitHub and Jira and Slack, things like Heroku and Travis, and how they might expose you to additional risk. As in this case, hackers were able to target those tokens and actually leak confidential information from private GitHub repositories.
Yeah, it's amazing how finding these and finding passwords stored, can come back and really haunt folks.
Yeah, it's redefining lateral movement in a way. A lot of people think about lateral movement as the stealing of tokens or the harvesting and cracking of Kerberos tokens or NTLM hashes on endpoints. And when you come into the SaaS world, you start to get a lot more tokens between user and application or device and application, and the ability to replay those tokens is part of the reason why SaaS is so contagious, why people like it, because they have single sign-on and you can really just reuse those tokens in a lot of different places. Now, one of the things that, if you might have caught in our title, RE-RE-REvil to the fifth, we've seen much like a resurgence and focus on things like interconnectivity risk, the resurgence of RE-RE-REvil. Now, for those of you that followed in a previous episode, we covered how members of the RE-RE-REvil attacking group were arrested and charged by the Kremlin on money laundering, but appears just as fast as they quote unquote disappeared, they have resurged, and they even have, their leak site is up and running and pointing to a new leak site. And these are just things that at first it might have been seen and hypothesized that it was a RE-RE-REvil imposter. But, and I think, David, you had a pretty strong comment on this, which is, if it looks like a RE-RE-REvil and it sounds like a RE-RE-REvil, is it probably a RE-RE-REvil? Am I quoting you correctly on that?
I think I said something about a duck, but yeah, it's about right. It seems like, does it really matter? The net effect is going to be the same here. It's interesting to see these coming back. I think we've heard some reports that Conti is back as well, and I think we should, the cybercrime is pretty lucrative. So even though some of these things get shut down from time to time, it sort of seems like whack-a-mole. They're going to pop back up.
Yeah, and the thing that I'm always thinking about is it that the one actor using a toolkit was shut down, like one attacker, one cell, one pod, or was it that the actual ransomware as a service offering was taken down? And more often than not, it appears that the attackers behind one particular attack are being targeted and taken down, and not necessarily the larger operators behind the infrastructure. Either that, or maybe they have such sophisticated and strong financial and technical backing that even if they do get taken down by authorities, it's easy for them to be resilient and pop right back up. So this is where we're going to launch our first poll. We'd like to hear from you. Is RE-RE-REvil back? And while we're giving everybody a chance to go through with that, I just wanted to come out and really echo the sentiment of one of our audience members, talking about why secret management and the importance of application security, especially when you think about cloud facing and SaaS applications that users can get to regardless of the device that they're on. Devices are more often now just access points, gateways to more important and valuable information stored in other places. And so assessing your interconnectivity risk and where you have tokens that could be taken and even giving you access to otherwise seemingly private GitHub repos or S3 buckets, these things are important to inventory and assess your risk profile against. Now, let's see what our audience thinks on the note of whether or not RE-RE-REvil is back. So David, it seems like a lot of people echo your sentiment. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, does it really matter? And a ton of people definitely in the camp, yep, RE-RE-REvil just can't get enough. So let's think about, what other threat actors and exploits are top of mind. One thing I just want to cover before we talk about our investigation into Hive ransomware is really, like, how does the reverse engineering of a piece of malware wind up on Varonis's blog, written by the Threat Labs team? So what might happen? A Varonis client, they might receive an alert or a notification from their Varonis system about some suspicious or abnormal activity that's happening in their environment. They might deem it so critical that they escalate to the global Varonis incident response team, where they're going to dive in to determine whether or not there's a real attack in progress, start to build out the timeline of what happened and collect artifacts to bring in our forensics team to do things like extract malware off of an endpoint and really start to take remediation and containment actions that might ultimately lead, this never before seen piece of malware into the hands of one of our researchers. So what David is going to walk through with you is really the output of that entire effort, that coordinated effort to identify and fix a Hive ransomware attack in a particular organization and what we learned from it. David, would you mind kind of stepping us through this investigation?
Yeah, sure. So Hive is another ransomware as a service provider. And I think what's interesting as we walk through some of what we uncovered there is how kind of off the shelf a lot of these attacks were. Very turnkey, from the vulnerabilities to the command and control, the shells, right, and how they used to beacon. And then what they did once they're inside, very, very standard playbook for this attacker. So why don't we dive in? Again, ransomware as a service, so it's centralized. Looks like good business continuity planning is probably in order for these guys,
And decent
right?
content marketing team. Shout out to the
Yep,
Varonis team for all the stuff that they put together.
absolutely. And this is what I was talking about. You want to talk through these vulnerabilities here
Yeah.
how
So
long ago was this,
yeah, I was
right?
going to say, I feel like ProxyShell, I mean, was that over more than a year ago? Right. I guess we can look at the
I think
naming
so.
convention since it's a Microsoft vulnerability. It would have been March of 2021. And it would have been, on that patch Tuesday back in March. By the time that, patches were fully made available in May of 2021, most organizations appear to have taken action against that. But even when we look at things like gray noise or gray matter defined, remotely exploitable hosts or Shodan, there are still a lot of, exchange servers that are facing the internet or that are exposed to ProxyShell from the inside of an environment, which allows for arbitrary remote code execution and privilege escalation, at least to the local admin or the exchange service that runs on the box, which is typically a very privileged account inside of an environment. And so this, while again, it is a story that we've heard before, leveraging everything that we're going to walk through in conjunction and avoiding detection does require, some sophistication and some real prowess when it comes to executing a cyber attack. Now, there was some other off-the-shelf type of tools that were used here. David, could you talk to us a little bit about that from a shell standpoint?
Yeah, just the initial web shell. What's interesting here is that it was it was off the shelf. It was something, if you wanted to Google for what's a web shell, this GitHub repo might well come up. You can see it was public or last committed, looks like on August 30th of 2017. This is what they used to then download, I think, another well-known piece, right, that we're kind of surprised didn't get picked up, which
So
was,
yeah, we use
yeah,
ProxyShell to drop how old is this 5-year-old web shell to then deploy Cobaltstrike and run some additional commands. Now, what I'm really curious about though, and David, maybe you've already thought about this. I thought that 6-year-old shells and Cobaltstrike was something that every single antivirus and endpoint provider could already pick up on. Is that the case, or did this research reveal some level of sophistication and obfuscation, and that it's the repackaging of the code that really makes it avoid detection?
well, I think the good news is there's some off-the-shelf obfuscators that can, obscure the code and make them a little bit harder to detect, right?
Yeah, so we had proxy shells, a lot of shells here. ProxyShell to PowerShell webhook to dropping Cobaltstrike to launching it, and we're gonna, I think, even led to a little bit more after that. But only about half the security vendors in an automated scan were able to flag this particular beacon as Cobaltstrike and take actions against it, which really just speaks to the needs for defense in depth and not just solely relying on one layer of security in order to identify something like a web shell or a Cobaltstrike beacon.
Yeah, definitely. You can't take it for granted, right? Just because it walks like a duck
Now,
doesn't mean you
yeah,
can spot
so
it, right?
just because like this attack keeps getting more and more with all the things that we always talk about, Mimikatz made an appearance with Hive as well. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so how long we've been talking about Mimikatz, right? It's this is just another kind of off the shelf tool that it's in the attacker's playbook every day. So again, I think what's remarkable is how unremarkable a lot of these techniques are.
And the end game here was really deploying encryption, was getting rid of some of the security controls that were running in order to have the deployment of the ransomware be successful. This was what we call windows.exe, even included things like clearing the Windows event log.
Standard operating procedure, right?
I guess is that the new norm? Not to to quote a phrase we probably all tired of hearing, but is it the new norm to see, if you don't patch a high rated vulnerability, an attacker is going to be able to, get a web shell on an unprotected machine? If you allow an attacker to dwell in your environment, they're going to be able to drop, and obfuscate more sophisticated attack toolkits like a Cobaltstrike or a Mimikatz. And if you do that, that's going to allow them to have at least system level privileges to modify registry settings, kill processes, and potentially unleash ransomware inside of the environment, where you wind up with getting one of these ransomware notes that says, hey, we encrypted all your data, we also exfiltrated it, you can start negotiating with us here.
Yeah, it certainly seems like this could be a cookbook, and it seems like there's a fairly low bar to entry here. Right. So if you've still got, if you still haven't patched for ProxyShell, right? It's this is kind of the standard playbook that it almost seems like maybe expect that to happen now, right?
Now, we did just cover a few legacy vulnerabilities. There are a few new and important vulnerabilities to keep in mind of, which we'll cover in our next segment, vulnerable vulnerabilities. So let's start by what is this RPC flaw, this CVE 2022 26809?
So this is another flaw in the remote procedure call mechanism in Windows, and this is reminiscent of Eternal Blue, which obviously was the vulnerability that we saw with WannaCry and NotPetya. Very scary, right? The original leak of the shadow brokers, right? That those massive exploits there. So this is similar. It's vulnerability in something called RPC RT4.dll, which is the RPC runtime DLL, there's an integer overflow bug, it looks like, which can lead to a heap buffer overflow. And essentially, you've got this DLL running a system on these Windows boxes, and if you can exploit it, you own the box. So I think that's why Bleeping Computer here says, it's as bad as it gets.
Now, one thing, you name drop some pretty like kind of industry changing vulnerabilities there. You talked about NotPetya, you talked about WannaCry. For those maybe in our audience that don't know what those things were, could you maybe kind of just give us a quick refresher on, well, first of all, what are they and why does that matter to this recently released RPC vulnerability?
Well, I think, that was the first kind of example of kind of wormable, a wormable exploit like this that was also coupled with ransomware, right? So we've got these vulnerable SMB servers that can be owned, and then it would kind of worm its way over to the next one. And I think that it kind of worked spectacularly well in an unintended way, right? It was I had some unintended consequences. I don't think the initial attackers had intended for it to spread. And, it disrupted shipping. It disrupted so many, I think I remember trains in Germany were disrupted, right? This was a big one.
And so I think what you're saying here, David, and again, keep me and our audience honest here. It's because that this vulnerability is likely on many, many hosts, that an attacker could leverage it to get the initial foothold on, say, some externally facing host, or if they're already inside the network on any host. And then because so many other hosts are also going to have this present, they'll be able to worm to those other hosts using just literally the exact same exploit.
Yeah, I think that the only gateway right now is I don't think we don't actually have an active exploit of this vulnerability. But if we did, I think you're exactly right. That's the potential for exactly that.
And one of our, I was gonna say, one of our audience members really thinks the same way. What they said is, if once there is a public exploit, it's going to be chaos. And we definitely agree with that. So if you haven't thought about that, we'll remind you again later, but definitely patch for this RPC vulnerability in Windows. Now, there was a mitigation that people were quick to point out about blocking it at the perimeter. Why is that not necessarily as effective?
Well, obviously, having these ports listening at the perimeter is something you want to address if that's something that you haven't addressed already. But I think that it's the internal lateral movement, right? That's also a big problem. We see how many vectors there are to get inside an organization.
I mean, I'll just
Once
steal
somebody,
your OAuth
yeah,
token and get to your private GitHub repo, drop your secrets from your GitHub repo, remotely connect into your application server. And then I guess since you blocked it at the perimeter and I couldn't use this RPC flaw, I'll just use that to get a foothold on a Windows box that maybe has a admin account with credentials running in memory, and then maybe leverage the stuff from Hive Ransomware in order to get the domain admin, right? I mean, isn't that everything we've been talking about today in a nutshell?
yeah. And I just see this as, this reminds me of some of the other vulnerabilities internally that we've seen, right? Like zero logon, is one that's just, this could be just as bad spreading internally. Once somebody has a foothold, any of these servers listening on 445 that aren't patched, I think are potentially vulnerable.
So curious from our audience members, how many of you still have hosts, or how many hosts do you think that are out there in the world that still have SMB exposed to the internet? Also, I had another audience member chime in about, really applying remediations for RPC vulnerabilities from the network edge to the core. I definitely agree with that, right? Obviously a remotely exploitable host is the one that's going to be targeted first. But you can't stop there. I would put it in equal priority to patch the things on the inside, because we do all know how many vectors there are to get into an organization. We only cover a handful of them on this web show.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how many people think there are out there.
Yeah, what do we think? So most people are
Yeah.
saying 4.2 million, but a good chunk saying 1.3 million as well.
Yeah, and I think 1.3, the middle answer is always the right answer, right, man?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to ask you, David. So the last thing that we want to cover, because we don't talk about hardware vulnerabilities enough, is there was some vulnerabilities found in Lenovo firmware, particularly in what's called the UEFI, or the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Now, what's really interesting about this, these are going to be abbreviated as CVE 2021-397071 and 72. 71 and 72 are actually vulnerabilities in a driver that gets embedded during the manufacturing process that's actually supposed to be removed from the build, from the BIOS, before it ships to consumers. So there's actually a little bit of an element of the supply chain gone wrong here, in a sense that these manufacturing drivers weren't pulled off and they themselves are vulnerable. Now, what makes this more dangerous, why is this trifecta of vulnerability so important, is if you are able to gain local access to one of these vulnerable laptops, you would be able to execute remote code, or I should say, you would be able to execute local code. It wouldn't be remote in the sense you'd need physical access. But the risky thing here is that it would be like a rootkit. These infections would persist both the operating system and if you replace the hard drive on the computer, because it's actually at the firmware in the BIOS level.
These are always so scary. It's like, I remember I always used to say, I just wipe it, wipe the hard drive, reinstall the OS, but the firmware, it's what do you do? Gotta, don't want to have to throw out your gear, right?
So, 2 segments left. This one's, we call It's a Humble Ask. This is really about just some takeaways from today, things to go and maybe get working on if you haven't already. First and foremost, definitely patch Spring4Shell, as well as the Windows RPC vulnerability. I can't say that enough. I mean, patching in general, if you don't hear that from a security practitioner, then, the odds are they're not paying attention to all the vulnerabilities that are coming out. Next, you really want to assess and protect your SaaS app interconnectivity. Evaluate your risk to an OAuth token in a third-party provider system that could give access to an otherwise private repo. Evaluate your risk to your own secrets potentially being exposed in your own systems or in your own code repositories, and definitely think about defending against the Hive. Even though, I don't want you to think that just because David said they followed the cookbook, that doesn't mean that it isn't, the threat level isn't high. The threat level isn't important and significant, because while they may follow the normal cookbook, they're successful. People are buying their goods and they are delivering, and that's something definitely to be concerned about. Now, but I think we have one more poll left. Is that right? Or sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to downplay the danger there. And, if you're Hive, you know, why wouldn't you exploit a vulnerability that's already known? You know, you may save your more sophisticated stuff for when you need it, right? There's no reason to give away a secret if you don't have to.
We appreciate you all being here. This is an absolute gem for me to participate in, and all of my crew and co-hosts. We really enjoy putting this together for you, and we hope that you enjoy it as well. And so thank you everybody for attending.